Today's episode has been brought to you by
Schedulicity.
Welcome, Connected Yoga Teachers. This is episode 63 of the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast with today's guest, Ashley Zuberi, a full-time yoga teacher who interviewed over 50 other full-time yoga teachers and compiled some amazing information to share with us. I'm so excited to bring this episode to you today. Ashley asked what challenges full-time yoga teachers faced, how many of them were financially independent, how many hours they were working per week, and what she really learned she shares with us today, and how this interview process, talking with over 50 full-time yoga teachers, how it really changed how she runs her own full-time yoga business. She talks about the difference in her mind of celebrity yoga teachers, studio owners, and independent yoga teachers. Also, we dive into what it's like to be a full-time yoga teacher and have this work-life balance that we're all sort of striving for. So I know this really well as being a mother of 3. And a surprising thing also came about in this interview, and I want you to give it some thought. I really love how Ashley brought up yoga as a legitimate career. So do you feel like teaching yoga is a legitimate career? And do the people around you recognize that you have a legitimate business or career as a yoga teacher? For those who don't know me already, I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a mother of 3, as I said, a yoga teacher and a consultant for yoga teachers who want to create a sustainable yoga business. I've talked to a lot of you this week who are feeling really overwhelmed, and what I love to do is really drill down and see what are your unique, amazing offerings in terms of yoga in some way, in your own unique way, and what business goals or what to do things are most important. So the yoga teachers that I talk to are often overwhelmed with so many ideas, so many things that they're seeing that others are doing or that are available to entrepreneurs and to yoga teachers, like creating an online course or working one-on-one. And it's hard to even know where to begin. The Connected Yoga Teacher podcast is a place where you can feel supported and connected every single week with information, inspiration, and a community of other yoga teachers and entrepreneurs. I wanted a place where you could tune in and listen as you drive, you garden, you clean between the classes, workshops, and trainings that you are teaching or attending. All of the show notes and links for today's episode can be found at theconnectedyogateacher.com/63. And a big extra bonus there, Ashley, with this information, has compiled a very large PDF, and I will put a link to that in our show notes. Thank you to our Connected Yoga Teacher team. Thank you, Laura, who writes our show notes, Samantha, who's our VA, our virtual assistant. She really keeps everyone on track. Our sponsor, Schedulicity, and to Rob, our audio editor. Let's have a listen to our hot tip of the week from Shannon of Schedulicity.
Hey, Connected Yoga Teachers. This is Shannon with the Schedulicity hot tip of the week. Successful full-time yoga teachers have a lot to deal with before they even hit the mat. Marketing, processing and tracking payments, checking people in and trying to make sure they all fit, accounting, keeping up with email correspondence and social media campaigns. You may feel like you need a personal assistant, or maybe you just need Schedulicity. You've spent hundreds of hours learning how to teach others to manage the complexities of their minds and bodies. Let Schedulicity manage the complexities of your online scheduling and marketing. You deserve a few hours to yourself.
Thank you, Shayna. Also, huge shout out of thanks to Jane, who is both part of the Schedulicity team, but also a member of our Connected Yoga Teacher online group. Jane commented on a thread inspired by Amanda Cool's question. So thank you also, Amanda, for asking the question. Amanda was asking if there's a way to text students directly. And Jane, in that thread, answered to say that at Schedulicity, they're going to be adding the ability to text students right from the app. I cannot say how excited I am for this. In April, I had to cancel a class that was canceled due to this kind of crazy freak snowstorm. I don't know if some Some of you remember that who are in Ontario. It hit all of us here in Ontario. And I knew that I could easily email everyone, but I knew also that most people would be at work and not checking their email. So I needed to go back to their intake forms, call them. Some of them weren't at home. They were at work. I wasn't sure which number I was calling. Text communication would have been the easiest way, and I didn't have everyone's cell phone number. So how amazing will it be when Schedulicity has the option to text people to let them know, like, hey, class has changed, or this thing has come up, or whatever, just like life does. One of my favorite things about Schedulicity is this, that they are listening to what we as yoga teachers need to make running our business easier. So thank you. And Jane, tell us, when does this come available? If you are wanting to book a consultation call to work with me, I would be thrilled to hear from you. On the Connected Yoga Teacher website, there's a button there that says Work with Shannon. I offer one-on-one consultation calls, either as packages or an individual call. And I really love to have a listen to what your yoga business is like, what your challenges are like. I have this system set up. I'll actually tell you my system. I divide my page into 4 sections. I'm looking at a current page right now, so I get this right. On the top left quadrant, I put down information about the person who I'm doing the consultation call with. On the top right, I list out the challenges that they start telling me about in their own yoga business and in their life. On the left quadrant, over on the left, bottom left, I list out the goals and the to-do, kind of what we established together, because it really is a joint effort to see what are the goals and the to-do tasks that are top of the list. So this is the overwhelm I was talking about earlier. Many people feel like they think of lots of things they could do, but I like to drill down and say what is going to bring profit and ease into your life and into your business. And then the bottom right is my to-do. My to-do. After our call, sometimes I like to send out links or information if I've told someone about a book or an app or something. And then all of that is recorded and sent back to you so that you can hear it back. And it's so empowering to hear yourself and to take notes then afterwards of what really came about. Thank you to Wanda, who sent me a testimonial about her consultation call with me. Wanda had a 90-minute initial call, and she shared how she was feeling really overwhelmed with a move because she didn't know anyone in the yoga community where she was moving to, and she felt like she was starting all over again in her business. So Wanda said, I was surprised how much content can be discussed in 90 minutes, how organized it was, and how everything made so much sense. Sometimes when you feel overwhelmed, you need someone that gives you a hand and can look at your situation with other eyes, especially when there is so much experience and expertise in the industry, which is Shannon's case. After the call, although I know I have a lot to do on my end, I see a light at the end of the tunnel. Suddenly, it does not feel like I'm going to start from zero when I relocate, and I don't feel as overwhelmed. I have very specific goals that Shannon helped me to create, and I feel more proactive that I can start working on some projects before I get to the new location. Thank you so much for sending this to me, Wanda. It really lights me up. I love to hear how things are going. I love to get updates. I know, Peely, you sent me a couple of emails this week of like, look, I've done my homework. So thank you, guys. It would be great to hear from you. Leave us a review if you're enjoying the podcast. To do that, you can go to our show notes page and there's a button right there that says leave a review, or leave me a voicemail. I love voicemails. There's a button on the Connected Yoga Teacher website over on the right. So let's dive in and meet Ashley. Ashley Zuberi is a yoga educator and military spouse from Northern Virginia. She first found yoga on a DVD. A few years later, she took some classes at the gym. Then, thanks to a friend, she began attending a studio where she discovered an incredible community of like-minded, interesting people. This community supported her physically, socially, and spiritually, and changed the course of her life. Ashley teaches group yoga classes, private yoga sessions, workshops on specialty topics, and trainings for those interested in deepening their personal practice and teaching yoga. She also mentors yoga teachers. Ashley loves weaving yoga philosophy into everyday life, and she always considers herself a student first. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, Ashley. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the last time we chatted, you were do you want to explain to our listeners what big project you took on?
Yeah, I decided that I was going to try and interview 100 full-time yoga teachers to really kind of ask some questions about what it looks like to teach yoga full-time. I was really curious about these questions because I'm a full-time yoga teacher myself, and I've been teaching full-time now for over 3 years, and it's really, really challenging. And I was just kind of curious after speaking with some of my own friends and colleagues where I live, if there were any patterns or tips or tricks or best practices that could be shared amongst the yoga community as a whole for teaching yoga full-time. And I kind of had a lot of questions around this that I was working through on my own, and I was curious what other people had to say. So I set out to do these interviews, and I got about halfway through, and I decided to stop the interviews after about 55, simply because it started to get logistically really challenging, which was interesting and not surprising. It's hard to get full-time yoga teachers on the same schedule because we're all always just running from client to client, from class to class, and there's not a whole lot of time for anything else. But I got through 53 interviews, and I started compiling the data for that, and I found some pretty interesting things.
So back this up a little bit. The biggest driver for you, you'd say then, was your own just experience as a yoga teacher and knowing the struggle of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I was thinking about was, in any other industry or any other kind of profession, oftentimes there are set paths. So you can kind of look at where you are in your career in an industry and see, or look ahead and see, like, these are the people in front of me and this is where I want to go. And this is what I need to do to get there. And it's not necessarily clear cut, but like there are examples out there. And where I kind of found myself was in a position where, well, I know kind of who is out there ahead of me and what they're doing, and I'm not interested in any of those roles. So for example, I could become a studio owner. I've always known before I even started teaching yoga that I really had no interest in owning a yoga studio. And then the other kind of role out there is kind of what we call this like celebrity yoga teacher, whether that's online now more of these days or kind of going through the circuits of teaching at big festivals and things like that. And I don't really have a desire to do that either. That doesn't really fit my personality. So then I was kind of like, well, where do I go? What do I do? And that's kind of the driving force. I was like, well, what are other people doing? Where are these role models and examples for how I can make this work sustainably long term? And so that's kind of where I started.
That's fascinating. And I think it's a struggle that many yoga teachers do face. Like, I completely understand not wanting to own a studio because that's like owning a brick and mortar business. So you're wanting to do your craft, and to share your yoga, but not have all of the studio. And I know what that's like because I've been a studio manager. So How did you go about then connecting with these 53 yoga teachers? Because even that seems like a large amount of people.
Yeah, it took me about 3 or 4 months to complete those interviews. And basically what I did was I started with who I knew. And then I would just ask the people that I interviewed if they knew other people, and they would bring me new people. And we just kind of went word of mouth. And then I posted in some Facebook groups as well that I knew had a lot of yoga teachers, and just kind of posted out a call to talk to me if they were interested. I explained a little bit about what I was doing with the project. And I had a lot of people respond to me from that. So between just kind of posting out on Facebook, talking to the people that I knew, and then asking for referrals, that's how I got the 53 teachers. And what was really cool was I got to talk to people from all over the world. So I talked to people from Australia, I talked to people in England, I talked to people in Hong Kong. I talked to someone who doesn't have a home base and just kind of travels the world and is wherever they are. And then, of course, lots of people in Canada, lots of people in the United States. So
That's fascinating. What if you could kind of summarize and say, like, here were some really interesting things, or here are some things that have affected your own way of doing yoga business? Like, what were some of the key things that you learned from it?
There were a lot of things, and I guess it kind of goes through each question that I asked. So one of the most interesting things I think that I found was, well, first of all, defining what a full-time yoga teacher is challenging, because it's not clear cut. And so I made it clear when I did the interviews that I only wanted to talk to people who made more than 75% of their income from teaching yoga. So I was hoping to kind of make sure that I was talking to people that were mainly yoga teachers, not people who half the time teach yoga and half the time do massage therapy or something else. So that's why I set that level of like 75% plus of your income comes from teaching yoga. And then I also made sure that nobody that I talked to owned a studio, because I only wanted to teach, or I only wanted to speak to full-time yoga instructors that were independent and were not owning studio. So then I asked a lot of different questions. One of the questions I asked was, how many hours a week do you think you spend on your business? The reason why that question was really interesting to me often came from the responses, because the initial response to that question was always something like a laugh or a big, huge sigh, or, oh, that's a really great question. Often people immediately were like, every minute of every day I spend on my yoga business. And so the initial reactions were like, oh my gosh, I spend so much time working. But then when I actually kind of drilled down and asked them to give me a number, it was just an estimate. A lot of people ended up saying like 20 hours or 25 hours. And to me, I was like, well, that's not really full time.
Right.
But that kind of gets into how another question that I asked, respondents, are you financially independent? Do you support yourself? And what I got, my data and my results, 3% of the teachers interviewed said that they were financially independent, which I actually thought was higher than I thought it was going to be. And I was super proud of that. I was happy that that many are able. Within that 43%, some of those people would say that they could financially support themselves if they needed to, but it wasn't necessary because they had a partner that was also contributing to the family. Yeah, 43% of the teachers interviewed said that they were financially independent or could be.
Okay.
So within that number, there were some who said, if I didn't have my partner, I could still support myself, but they weren't necessarily as driven to do that because they also had help. And so within that kind of helps then explain a little bit of the people who would say they work 20 to 25 hours a week. Oftentimes they were the ones, well, no, I'm not financially independent and I could never do that. They tended to have more support and more help. And so financial independence wasn't a motivating factor for them, which is fine. But what was interesting was that they still felt like they were spending all of their time working on their business, and they were only spending like 20 to 25 hours. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are the people that are reading and spending 60, 70 hours a week on their business. Average ended up coming out to about 42, which in my own personal experience feels. And so, yeah, there's just there's a spectrum of within teaching full time, how much work and effort teachers are actually putting into this. And I think that kind of directly correlates then to how successful you are.
Do you think those yoga teachers that feel like they're spending all of their time, and when you drilled it down, it was only 20 hours, do you feel like maybe their mind is sitting there all of the time?
Absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the, I'm working all the time on this comes from. But that's not so different. I guess this is another thing that I found. At the end of the day, teaching yoga isn't really that different from any other job. Like a lot of the challenges and a lot of the issues that came up weren't super specific to yoga.
Right.
So for example, another question that I asked was, what is your biggest challenge being a full-time yoga teacher?
Right.
And the challenges that came up were not necessarily specific to yoga. They kind of felt like they were general to everybody who, no matter what your job is. So for example, a lot of people said that financial planning and feeling abundant is their biggest challenge in teaching yoga. And although finding like consistency in finances might be unique to yoga or someone who's a fitness professional or anyone who is an independent contractor and just has variability, their income, everybody kind of struggles with financial planning and figuring out how to just make your life work.
Right.
Other people were really challenged by setting boundaries, knowing when to stop working, when to say no, or how to find more work-life balance.
And I know that one really well.
And again, like, yes, that I can see how that's a huge deal in yoga and in teaching yoga, but it's not specific to the profession.
Right.
And then the next biggest response was self-care and keeping up with a personal practice. That is specific to the profession. It's more important, but self-care is important for everyone. Time management came up a lot. Marketing, trying to wear all the hats as a small business owner and entrepreneur, exhaustion. So nothing that was super, like, nobody was saying, my biggest challenge is coming up with sequences, or my biggest challenge is, knowing how to teach this specific population.
That's fascinating to me because often I feel like yoga teachers will gravitate towards that. Like, oh, well, I just need this one more training, or to learn this one more thing, or to buy this book. And then, but you're saying the big challenges that people could tell you were really foundations of running a business.
Absolutely. And I also asked, have you ever been burnout before? And every single person said yes. Almost. I think maybe one or two people said no. And when I asked them what they do to overcome that burnout or kind of get back on track, one of the most common answers was do a new training, learn something new. And I personally thought that was fascinating because to me, that's just like adding more information and just like adding on things when oftentimes that burnout comes from too much. Like, to me, it seems like you would need to do less.
Right. It is interesting that that's what we gravitate towards. If you were thinking, you take say you fly to a nice sunny location and take a training. If you took that same location, the money and your time, and invested it in a week or two off.
Right. Yeah. Another question that I asked is, are you kind of where you want to be in your yoga career right now? And what came back was interesting. I kind of got half and half responses. Half said yes, half said no. But a lot of people were kind of like, well, yeah, I'm proud of where I'm at. I'm happy where I'm at, but there's always more to learn. As yoga teachers, and especially it seemed as full-time yoga teachers, were dedicating our life to this practice and to teaching this practice, that idea of like always wanting to train more and never knowing enough came up all the time. There was this issue with contentment, which I found funny, because that's part of the practice that we teach.
Right. So, that's fascinating. My goodness, what a gift to have talked to all these different people and then be able to step back and take a look at the data that you're compiling. How do you compile all of that?
So basically, I separated it by question, and then when I was interviewing each person, I was taking notes underneath each question that I asked them, and then I go back per question and look at every single person's response, and I would often categorize kind of how the responses piled up based on similarities to kind of pull out the patterns. I would aggregate that where I could. I would assign numbers to it and percentages. And then I can also pull out quotes that really stood out to me from the different people that I interviewed and add that to support kind of some of the more hard data. So it's certainly not an academic study by any means. It's not professional, but I'm doing the best that I can to kind of pull it all together. And I was really looking at what could be most useful to share with the yoga community as a whole in terms of what I'm seeing, what answers were coming back over and over again. And what I ended up finding was that there is no real pattern. There is no real one way. Everybody kind of went about it on their own unique path. But the kind of foundation seemed to be mindset. If you had the mindset kind of approaching your yoga business from that as an entrepreneur and a small business owner, they were completely different than someone who had the mindset of being a yoga teacher.
Right. That's so fascinating. I see that in so many of the yoga teachers that I work with. Do you have any idea how people switch and get to that mindset of not, I'm just a yoga teacher, but I'm a yoga entrepreneur, or I run a small business where I teach yoga?
Well, I think first ask is, do you want to be an entrepreneur? Do you want to be a small business owner? Do you know what that entails? And I don't think it's useful to ask, do I have the skill set? Because it can be learned. But just, do you have desire to do that? And I think a lot of people don't realize how much work it is. I kind of, way back when, in 2012, quit my job to have my own business with the understanding that it was going to free me up with so much time, and I was going to have all this flexibility. And while that was true, I worked more on my new business than I ever did going into an office.
Right.
So it wasn't like I got any more time. I got less time, and it wasn't like I was working less, I was working more. So I was a little jaded back then, but like understanding the realities of that, and then kind of, if that's what you really want to do, I think what happens is people who want to teach yoga full time, they think, I want to share this practice all day long, and they probably have experience teaching yoga a few times a week, part-time, and they love it, and they want to transition to that full time. And what they don't realize is that to be successful, teaching is the least amount of time you'll spend doing anything. You spend most of your time marketing, building relationships. Depending on how you set up your business, you're not spending most of your time teaching.
Mm-hmm. So true. And it's not like you could hire all of that out right from the beginning. I think you have to really have a good understanding of how to market yourself. And what makes it maybe tricky for yoga teachers as opposed to like a car mechanic is that it's really your personality that shines through in your marketing as well. Like if you do videos, emails,
And those are all skills that can be learned. You just have to be willing to do it. While I wasn't asking these questions specifically, I could kind of tell based on how people were answering questions when they were, this kind of goes back to the mindset, when they were just stuck. So one thing that I found was that when teachers were willing to look at innovative and creative new ways to get their name out there, when they were willing to do anything and everything, go knock on doors, print out their own flyers, hand them out, talk to anyone that they met on the street, they seemed to be like the most successful and felt the most successful. And the teachers who kind of were staying within the traditional realm of what we all kind of know works, trying to get classes at studios, trying to just, make announcements in their classes, but not really go outside of the box, outside of the studio. They felt stuck, and they felt stuck in their careers. They didn't know what to do. And they weren't necessarily willing to look at these more creative, innovative things.
Mm-hmm. That really takes me back and reminds me of when I was a brand new teacher, and I was doing exactly what you said, like telling people in my class, like bring your friends, and hardly advertising, still really keeping in touch with my yoga students. And then I was running also in the summer a farmer's market. And so I just had my yoga brochure at my farmer's market table, and people would ask me about it all the time. And once I was talking to them, then I was seeing that they were showing up in my yoga class.
Right. I think that this kind of narrative is prevalent in the yoga community right now, but the traditional way of doing things that we've all known for the past, maybe 10 years or so is starting to break, and it's getting really competitive. And we have to look at new ways of doing things. And just as in any industry, those who are not willing to innovate will probably get left behind.
Right. And so in looking at all that, what would you say to the yoga teachers who feel like, because I work with a lot of yoga teachers and I have felt it myself, kind of this, well, yoga should be free, or I don't want to push and be salesy in my yoga. Do you have anything that you learned from talking to other teachers?
Not specifically with that particular question. The marketing, honestly, it all comes down to building relationships. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of investment. Building those personal relationships with people. I find in my own teaching, I've done a lot of work online, and it hasn't really translated into bigger classes in the studio. The work that I do, spending time talking to my students goes so much further than, posting something on Facebook. And even, printing out flyers and posting them up around town, like the conversations, the one-on-one conversations that you have with people are far more meaningful and move the needle more than kind of just doing those traditional marketing things. So I would say, in terms of like not wanting to feel salesy, you don't have to sell anything. You just have to talk to people, and I think just having those authentic, like genuine conversations and really, wanting to know about how people are doing and what's going on in their life and sitting there and listening to them, that means more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's such a key point. And you, like you said, you might be delivering the posters and then bump into someone who's asking you, oh, what is that? Or even just the businesses that you're going to.
Having something that's like a takeaway as a marketing piece is far more effective than just posting a flyer somewhere on a community board, because then you have that opportunity for dialogue and engagement.
Yeah, so a great example of that might be if a yoga teacher approaches a group that they can talk at, a group that might, like I'm thinking of the Women's Institute group in my area. They're so sweet. And they were like, can you come and talk to our group about yoga for pelvic health? I was like, certainly.
Yeah. Those are awesome opportunities.
Yeah. But you don't always see the return right away. It's not like then you have, okay, everyone signs up at the end of that workshop. It's kind of, like you said, it's building relationships and it's over time.
Yeah, it's always a long-term thing. And we have to have the patience to let that play out. And that can be hard sometimes.
And so is there anything that you've changed in your own yoga business now with the information that you had?
Actually, yes. One of the things that I realized was that I was spending a lot of time and investing a lot in building up an online platform. And I actually decided to scale back from that. I realized when looking at my own finances that all of my money was coming from the classes that I was teaching, the time that I was in studio, and I was spending a majority of my time kind of marketing and trying to build up these online programs and online things, but I wasn't getting any return from them, or very little return from them. And so just in being able to kind of look at how I spend my time and where my time is worth most value, it was in staying local and in the community and building those relationships and being with people, not sitting behind my desk trying to write things and post them online and have discussions on Facebook. Although sometimes that stuff feels good because you think that you are building up something that can eventually give you passive income, that takes a really long time and a really special skill set, and a lot of money, a lot of investment to really do well. And I wasn't willing to or able to right now at this point in my life dedicate time to that. And so I kind of scaled all of that back, and I'm kind of in the middle of retooling and deciding how I want to use my online presence that I have built to better integrate with my in-person stuff, because that's where I get the most fulfillment in my teaching, and that's where I'm making the most money.
That's fascinating. And I think, it might be a real relief to the yoga teachers who are thinking that they need to put things online and are struggling with the tech side of things, or just even enjoying it. Like you said, you like to be in person. And I think on the flip side, there are a bunch of yoga teachers who are doing exactly that. I know I work with a lot of teachers who are saying, I need to get this course online. And you use the exact words that I hear so often, this passive income. And Natalie Ekdahl talked to us in a previous podcast about, she doesn't call it smart passive income like Pat Flynn does. She calls it smart active income, that you still have to work at it, really work
so
at
much.
it. Yeah.
And I've been, like, my background before yoga is marketing. So I understand how that all works. And I worked a lot with people in the online business space, helping them market their programs and products. So I've kind of seen the behind the scenes of what it takes to really make that work. And it is so much more complex than you think. And it takes just a really dedicated amount of time to build that up and make it work for you. And I just ran out of time. Between teaching the amount of classes that I needed to teach each week to make the money that I needed to make to support my family, I didn't have any more time left in the day to dedicate to building that up the way that I knew it needed to be built up for it to work.
That's fascinating. Well, I really appreciate you bringing that forward. Like, this is something that you learned. Was there anything else that you feel like you implemented in your own yoga business?
So the other thing the one question that early on, one of the respondents that I talked to asked me to ask this question to everybody that I interviewed. And that question was, do you feel supported? And that was another fascinating question to ask, because almost everyone had some version of no in their answer. And what I mean by that was, oftentimes people would say, well, when I asked that question, oftentimes people would pause and then have to think about it. So there were very rarely any immediate yeses. And then the answers were often complex, where they would say, well, I feel really supported by my students. I feel really supported by maybe one of the communities that I teach in. I feel really supported by a couple teachers who I have really good friendships with and who mentor me. But very rarely did anyone feel supported by the yoga community as a whole. Oftentimes, people felt the more knit a community was, the more support people felt. So people in very specific communities that had kind of developed or built those communities for themselves felt super supported by the people in those communities. But if you were outside of a community and just generally teaching and you didn't really have a niche, that support was much harder to come by. People felt supported by Facebook groups and online things, but they didn't feel supported in their own communities. They didn't feel like they had in-person support where they lived and where they taught. So something that I haven't done yet, but I've been thinking a lot about, is how to kind of take this information and create some type of support locally where I am, and then also what does that look like to create support on a more global level for yoga teachers.
Well, that is something I can really get behind and support if you feel like, okay, Shannon, I want to collaborate in some way. Because I feel like that was the whole driving force behind the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast was I felt like, as myself, and I've said this many times, that I felt like I was kind of alone in this wilderness of yoga entrepreneurship. And I was talking to other yoga teachers who felt the same. And at the same time, like, I belonged to a studio. We had a great group there. We have a local, Grey Bruce yoga teacher group. We were getting together. And then globally, I felt pretty connected with other yoga teachers. So for me to feel that, I can't imagine what it's like for someone to leave a teacher training that's far away, go back to your home community, and you're, one of the only ones. Or, like you said, you're not part of a studio or part of a community in some way.
Right. And a lot of people that I interviewed, especially more in, like, if you were to consider yourself a yoga therapist, the people that considered themselves yoga therapists tended to also be the people that were doing kind of different things in terms of business models and how they were going about teaching, because that's not necessarily something that's always easily offered in a studio environment right now. So sometimes these people they didn't own their own studio, but they rented space, and they would offer so many classes a week out of their own space that they rented. They would do interesting and different things. And so it was really interesting to hear their business models, but then they felt completely isolated because they were doing something totally new, totally different. It was disruptive in their community, so they weren't getting support. In fact, they were oftentimes trying to be shut down by the other communities and studios in the area because they were competition now. And since they were kind of on their own and doing something a little bit different, they just didn't have support in their local communities. And yet they kept at it and kept going. And I was so proud to hear some of the stories of the people, especially in the smaller towns. I live in the Washington, D.C. metro area, which is a market that can absolutely support someone teaching full time. There are a million studios here, and you could easily find enough classes to teach just in studios to support yourself. And there's a lot of people here. There's a lot of wealth here. So it's not really hard for me to make that work. But I've also lived in much smaller towns where I don't know what I would do. Like I couldn't do what I do here in some of the other places that I've lived. And so to hear people, I talked to one woman in Moorhead, Minnesota, which I happen to have a friend that lives in that area, and it's kind of a suburb of Fargo, South Dakota. And that's just kind of like the middle of nowhere. And we don't think of like yoga thriving in that community. And yet here she was being like a full-time yoga teacher, specializing in teaching kind of, special needs students. And I was like, this is just amazing. Like that people in these small towns are making this happen. It can be done. It just takes a certain kind of mindset and willpower to do it. So I thought that was awesome.
It does. That is amazing. I find it also very bizarre if you think, most people who are becoming yoga teachers have at some point touched on to the importance of supporting other people and really looked at their own stuff and gone through the 8 limbs. And yet we still have this where most yoga teachers are not feeling supported. I wonder how that can be addressed even in yoga teacher training.
Yeah, that's something that I think about. I help lead teacher trainings, and I definitely want to look at some of this and look at how it can be shared in teacher trainings to help people before they even get out in the teaching world. I have to wonder, though, how much the kind of current climate of like studios contributes a little bit to this. And just the competitive nature of studios, and it's not, I'm not blaming the studios or saying that it's on them. It's just kind of the cost of doing business in a way. Like it is hard to own a yoga studio, and it is hard to keep a yoga studio running, and it's a numbers game, and you kind of have to do what you have to do to hit those numbers. And oftentimes that means, maybe not paying your teachers that much, or as a studio owner, you just have so much going on and so much responsibility. You can't dedicate time to supporting your teachers. And that often becomes an afterthought. And then all of a sudden, teachers don't necessarily feel supported in their workplace environments, or they have to create that support on their own. And they're so busy doing other things because they have other jobs or they're trying to make ends meet that it always just kind of becomes the last thing that we pay attention to. And it should be the first thing that we pay attention to. Just like our
I find that
practice.
Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Personal practice is another one that I hear over and over from yoga teachers that it's either non-existent or they really struggle with it. And for sure myself, like I feel pretty good today because I got my yoga practice in, but last week was pretty hit and miss.
Yeah. Well, my thing on that is I think we have to redefine what that means. I know that when I was teaching for the first couple of years, I had this idea in my head that your personal practice meant, going to your 60-minute studio class. And I can't fit that in. Like I teach every single time slot that there is, so the time that I have available is 1:00 in the afternoon when nobody is taking yoga, and there are no yoga classes. So I had to redefine what personal practice meant. Personal practice for me now is, do I get time to sit for 15 minutes and do my meditation? Do I get time to be on my mat and move in whatever way that feels good to me for 10 or 15 minutes? If I have the time someday to get in a full 60-minute practice, that's a luxury. But that doesn't mean that I don't still get on my mat and spend whatever time I can there. And maybe it's not movement, maybe it's meditation, maybe it's just breathing consciously. But what that means has changed a lot from when I began.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a good point. And, it needs to feel like it's a nurturing self-care practice. That's what I have found over the years. And especially, you collecting that data and saying almost 100% of yoga teachers have experienced burnout, then we need to stay on top of that and keep that self-practice going, in some way that's nurturing, not in a beating myself up, I have to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I find too that my teaching suffers if I'm not doing my personal practice. I'm not inspired in my teaching.
Exactly. Me as well. Yeah. No, I also have to do my own practice mostly at home because my favorite time and the best time in my day is 5:30 in the morning. And there are no yoga classes at 5:30 where I live. So, yeah. Anything that you could share with yoga teachers with this information that you have now? Anything that you wish that yoga teachers would keep in their mind or know?
Yeah. The biggest thing that also came out of this for me is positivity. Like, people are really yearning for positive these days. And sometimes the conversations that are happening in the yoga community kind of devolve really quickly into negativity and critiquing. And people are really looking for that support, that positivity. And what inspired me so much, as I mentioned before, was talking to teachers from all over the world and hearing how everybody is making it happen. And there's a positive message in there that everybody is challenged. Everybody's struggling. Everybody's having a hard time. Nobody has any answers, but we're all doing it. And we're all sharing such an amazing practice and impacting so many people. And although it's hard sometimes to see the long-term gain of that, like, it's really amazing what we're doing. And I think we need to not lose sight of that and keep that positive message in the forefront and share that positive message as much as we can.
I feel like I could play that like every day. Woo-hoo! That was like a great cheerleading.
Yeah. And one other thing that I would say too is something that I kind of looked at, I found interesting as I was going through. Most of the people that I spoke to were women. There were a few men. There was a wide range of ages, but almost everyone I spoke to, I think only 3 people that I spoke to had young children, like under the age of 5. And that was really interesting to me, because it seems like what happens, just anecdotally from what I've seen and observed, is that if you start teaching yoga when you're young, which many people do, then they kind of have to make a choice. 1, do they want to have a family? And 2, if they do, are they able to continue teaching? And oftentimes you see kind of a lot of yoga teachers filter out of the system once they hit the age of, 30, 35, and they choose to start having a family, and then they no longer teach because it's really hard to teach with young children. And then all of a sudden you kind of lose a lot of really qualified yoga teachers. So the full-time yoga teachers that I spoke to, only 3 had really young children. If the others had children, they were older, and they didn't come to teaching until after their children were older. And then a lot of teachers just did not have kids and didn't necessarily have any desire to have kids. And when I look at kind of, this goes back to in the very beginning when I said, I'm looking at the people in front of me and what they have done. If you look at a lot of the celebrity yoga teachers, a lot of them chose not to have children or families. And that's a really interesting role and model that I think we need to look at. And that goes back to the support. Like, how do we support each other so that we can, if we want to have families, still be able to do this full time? But also, what needs to be in place for us to be able to manage that and make this a legitimate career? And so those were some of the questions that I started looking at and started pondering, and I'm excited to continue to look at.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole other
it is a whole
thing.
other project.
That's fascinating to hear the numbers. And I know my own story. I work with a lot of people who have young children, and you see it like in other careers as well. They kind of drop away. And as yoga teachers, we work with a lot of new moms, pregnant moms.
Absolutely.
It's great to have an understanding of what they're going through and what they're dealing with. And if we lose the yoga teachers who have that understanding, we kind of lose that, like, what we can give and offer. Not that we have to have had children and be pregnant, but it certainly does add something to it,
Yeah, absolutely. And just the fact that, this goes back to this being like, this is a larger societal issue. This is not yoga specific. This does not just happen in the yoga industry. And, speaking from a woman's perspective on, what is that balance between choosing to have a family and having a career? And what does that look like specifically in the yoga industry? Is it possible? Yes, of course it's possible. And that's the positive message, like, anything is possible. And that's what I've seen from talking to all of these different teachers, like hearing all of these different stories. As I said before, it's super inspiring, and it made me feel like, I'm not alone, and I'm struggling, and I have challenges too, but so do these people, and they're making it work, so I can do it too. And you just have to get creative and think outside the box. And, we have to step up as teachers if we want to stand up for yoga as a career and a profession, and that's another conversation. But if we want to make this work, work, then we have to find new ways, new models, and new support systems to create that and model that for others and those that will come after us.
That's great. If people want to connect with you further, so you're teaching more in-person classes, but you do have online offerings as well. And you said that you have a yoga teacher training. Is the best way through your website? Yeah,
my website is ashleyjosephine.com. And I have, most of my teaching is in person. I do have some things online. And I'm going to be kind of shifting more into just writing. So I have a lot on my blog. That's the best place to go to find me.
Yeah, I started going through your blog and I was like, oh, there's some really great things here. I'm sorry, Ashley, not even sure. Do you have a young family? Do you have children at home?
I do not. I'm going to be turning 30 this year. So it's certainly in the forefront of my mind of, what I'm going to be doing. And I need to make that choice. And there will be some big life decisions coming up in the next year or so for my family. So that was kind of like why I was asking these questions and why I was super curious about it. Just, I don't have any models necessarily for people who have continued to teach yoga full time and had young children. And a lot of my friends have kind of stepped away from teaching. I'm in a particularly interesting, just personal situation. My husband, who has, really largely supported my ability to do this, I'm very proud of the money that I make teaching yoga, and I could absolutely support myself on my own if I had to, but the lifestyle that I live is certainly supplemented by my husband's full-time job, and the income and the insurance that I'm able to have because of his work. But he's going to law school at the end of this year, starting in the fall, and that's going to be the next 3 years of our life where we don't have that income. And so now it's going to be on me to support our family. And, I need to look and see how I can do that. And, we're talking about having children and what that looks like. And the next 3 years of our life are going to be pretty crazy. So,
for sure. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because that really brings it home. And I know you're not alone in this. Like, yes. I work with other yoga teachers who are dealing with similar situations. And, I just love that you've opened the conversation here and dug in, did some research. And I think I would definitely be up for a continuation of this conversation in the Connected Yoga Teacher group or in the comments of the podcast to see who's making it work, who's supporting themselves and is able to mother, be a parent, and whether that's a single parent or a parent in a relationship. It would be great to continue that conversation.
Absolutely. And then I'll share too, I did ask how much money people made in an anonymous. So after I did the interviews and I finished and I decided that I was going to kind of end the interviews, I sent out an email to everyone that I interviewed and asked them to anonymously fill out a survey just telling me how much money they made if they were comfortable sharing. And what came back was a majority make less than $25,000 a year. That's in US dollars. So about 41% said that they make less than $25,000. Both 17% said they made between 25 and 35. Another 17% said they made between 35 and 50. 11% said they made between 50 and 75,000. 5.9% said they made 75 to 100, and another 5.9 said they made over 100,000. So large range, but certainly a lot more on the lower end.
That is something yoga teachers need to be making more than that if they're doing this 75% of the time.
Yes.
They really do. And feeling like they're working 100% of the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's a great conversation to open and to be like, you know what, this is where we're at, and how can we all as a community move forward and see this more as a profession, support each other, feel supported.
Yeah. And that, I think that is just evolving, and there are a lot of conversations around that. And when you look at yoga's history and teaching yoga as a career and a profession, being a full-time independent yoga teacher is very new. This wasn't really necessarily possible for most people even 10 years, 15 years ago. Being a yoga studio owner, as I mentioned before, was kind of always the traditional path. And then everybody opened yoga studios. And because there were so many yoga studios, now all of a sudden it was possible to make a living just teaching. But that has only come about in the past, 10 or 15 years or so for most people. And before that, it was just super rare. And then when you really go back in history and in yoga and in the philosophy, teaching yoga was a profession that was sponsored by royalty in India. It was something that you didn't make any money necessarily, but the royal family just took care of you. And it was more in line with the profession of like a priest or, a religious person than it was a career that what we're doing today. So we're very new in even having this career. There are conversation threads out there about, should it even be a career? Is it something that you should even do? I've heard people say things like, who are you to think that you should be able to make money and support a family teaching yoga full time? So there's a lot of opinions out there on what this is, teaching yoga full time, and is it a career? And so that's another whole area for discussion.
It sure is. I certainly am in the camp where, the more it's a career for people, the more sustainable it is, the more yoga is going to get shared. It won't just be royalty.
Exactly.
Who can invest
it's about
in
making
it.
it more accessible.
Yeah, it is. Oh, thank you so much for this. This has been fascinating.
You're welcome.
I feel like, you asked some great questions, and your insight is, it's just really been a gift today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for letting me share. I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Okay, connected yoga teachers, how was that? Thank you, Ashley, for all of this information, for your insight, for your experience. I love how you dug into some of the harder questions, especially around what are our challenges as yoga teachers. So just to go over those again, the biggest one for yoga teachers was financial. And so for me, I think it's super important that we're talking about our finances, that we're supporting each other, that we're sharing what's going on with finances. And I'm going to look at how I can do that a little bit more on the podcast for you in case that is helpful. Also, some other challenges were work-life balance, self-care, time management, marketing, entrepreneurship, managing studios, and exhaustion. So again, Ashley touched on this, that it wasn't sequencing or picking the perfect music, although I know we really turn to those. These are the ones that full-time yoga teachers are needing support with, and a lot of them are what entrepreneurs in general need support with. So 32% of the yoga teachers that Ashley spoke with were financially independent, and the average work week for them was 42 hours per week. The average number of classes per week was 11, and close to 100% of those yoga teachers had experienced burnout at some point. And I know this well. I have as a yoga teacher, and this is why it's super important to me to keep coming back to how can I take care of self? How can I come back to my practice? Ashley asked a question that really has me thinking. She asked, are you where you want to be in your yoga career right now? I would love to dig in and discuss this a little bit further. This week, I'm going to be sharing a question in the Connected Yoga Teacher directly related to this in our Facebook group. She also talked about the need and the desire to be an entrepreneur and what that really looks like. So sometimes we think, oh yeah, yoga teacher, like I would love to teach yoga all day. And that is really the smallest portion of maybe the work that we do. Ashley also touched on how the most important work is about building relationships. And she touched on this. We both talked about, the desire is there to build online offerings. And I often see that yoga teachers are wanting to jump online and build the relationships online, me as well. But sometimes that's not what moves our business forward. I mentioned in this episode Pat Flynn of Smart Passive Income. And I just want to reiterate again that Pat Flynn is not sitting on a beach full time, kicking back, relaxing, earning income. He still has to work, and he works really hard at what he does. So Natalie Ekdahl, thanks for bringing this to my attention long ago, that it could be called smart active income. Ashley had a great quote that I love. She said, "You don't have to sell anything, you just need to talk to people." So if you are having trouble marketing your yoga, see how you can just simply put yourself out there where you're in the space of talking to people. Also, I love the question that she asked, do you feel supported? And I'm curious to hear from some of you. Are you feeling supported in your yoga business? And are you feeling supported that this is a legitimate career, a legitimate business, and that you are running a business? This I really love to dig into because I feel like the mindset starts with us. We could turn out and look at the people around us and say, people aren't taking me seriously, but are we feeling like this is a serious business and a serious career? Ashley shares in the document the average annual income. I took part in this interview process with her myself as an individual and as an independent yoga teacher. And I was really impressed with how she asked this question. So she had done all of the questions, and then at the end, she sent out an anonymous question on its own. So an anonymous survey. So she wasn't connecting a certain person and they didn't have to answer in that. I think it was a brilliant way to do it. So the biggest percentage of yoga teachers, 41% of them were earning $25,000 or less. 18% were earning $25,000 to $35,000. Another 18%, $35,000 to $50,000. 12% were earning $50,000 to $75,000. 6% were earning $75,000 to $100,000. And then the last little chunk, 6%, were $100,000 plus. So I think this is really great to get into the conversation of what would I like my annual income to be, and really set that up. And I think it all goes back to feeling like this is a business. And if we were running any other business, say if we decided that we wanted to sell lemonade on the side of the road and we were going to buy our lemons, spend the time doing it, we would have to figure out how much profit am I going to make, set up the same business mindset with your yoga business. And lastly, Ashley talked about how we can work to create a supportive network in our own yoga community. And I feel like we have that in Owen Sound, in the Owen Sound area where I live. But it could use a little bit of work, a little bit of effort on my part to reach out and just connect with yoga teachers. I love to go to workshops and classes, and I feel like I'm connecting with little pockets of people, but I'm going to look at how can I create this supportive network in my own community? Could we have a gathering like 4 times a year or even once a year? So I'd love to hear from you. What are you doing to create a supportive network for your yoga teacher community? Also, if you have ideas of an online supportive network for yoga teachers, let me know. Ashley's interested in doing this. I'm interested in doing it. Maybe there are some others out there who are also mentors or working to support yoga teachers in some way, and we can all kind of take turns, and how amazing would that be? Okay, connected yoga teachers, stay connected to self, to your practice, and to your community so that you can really share the yoga that lights you up. Namaste. Have a fantastic week.